Hey, Sabrina Monarch of Monarch Astrology and Magic of the Spheres podcast. I'm going to be talking to you about the full moon eclipse that's happening in Virgo. The moon in Virgo will be on the south node. So we have a big pattern here of releasing perfectionism, or maybe something getting kicked up that's bringing us in touch with our tendencies towards perfectionism. And this is made all the more dramatic by the Sun-Saturn conjunction in Pisces. So let me show you the chart for a moment here for an illustration. This eclipse will be on March 14th, different times depending on your time zone. We have the Sun and Saturn in close conjunction in Pisces. And I'm going to be focusing a lot on that in this video because that is the light that's shining on the Virgo moon. So whenever we think about perfectionism, right, or needing to get things in alignment, getting things organized and perfect and all in line, and Virgo is, of course, such a conscientious, thoughtful, beautifully meticulous sign. It's not just perfectionism. But if we are holding ourselves to these certain kind of standards or we're getting nervous about getting things just right, it's in relationship to an ideal, a standard, if you will. So, how perfect is it that a sign or a planet that relates to standards in a sign, Pisces, that is about ideal and fantasy, is what is bearing down on this moon here. So I wrote something up. The written version goes to my mailing list. If you'd like to have the written only versions or just have that as well as these videos, go ahead and sign up for my mailing list. While you're here watching this, go ahead and like this video right now. Just do it and leave a comment at some point while you're watching and let me know what's resonating with you, what you're taking away, how you're doing. Of course, also subscribe to this channel. So here we go. This full moon eclipse in Virgo is likely going to offer us changes of heart and perspective when it comes to perfectionism and high punishing or unrealistic fantasies and standards therein. Right? This might not be totally conscious of like, oh yeah, I'm being hard on myself or I'm being a perfectionist right now. It can take the disguise of logic and reason and what's reasonable, what we should be doing, etc. And the desires that we have in of themselves for success or ecstasy, like we're looking at, this is happening with Sun-Saturn conjunction in Pisces. So this is also about living our best life and living our high dream. These desires that we have for excellence or for our dreams materialized, these things aren't wrong by any means. Like having a dream is not wrong. But we likely pick up distortions along the way of having these dreams and desires, along with our attempts to control or manipulate outcomes. The Sun and Saturn will be exactly conjunct or cazimi at 22 degrees of Pisces on March 12th, a few days before the full moon, where the Sun and Saturn will only be 1.5 degrees apart. Cazimis are whenever you have a planet conjunct the Sun, and it's this moment of purification and rebirth for that planet that's entering the heart of the Sun, and we can be having like an intensified visionary experience about that planet's archetype. So in this case, Saturn is where we're having some visionary experiences right now. Then the full moon on March 14th is an eclipse in 23 degrees of Virgo with the moon in close conjunction to the south node in Virgo. So highlighting release or some kind of theme about Virgo that's getting kicked up, relived, reprocessed, that we're having a karmic experience with at this moment. So let's get into Sun-Saturn, right? The contact between Sun and Saturn can be harsh but transformative. I'm going to open a few themes and swirl around that with you guys for a bit. I'm going to kick up the drama, right? Because it is the Sun, and I think it can illustrate the archetype. But do consider like the nuanced or subtle way that this is actually showing up for you and see what resonates. So negatively, or in its most subjective or unpleasant form, right? What are we going up against? Sun-Saturn is like the surveying gaze of a superior, of a tough mentor, of a demanding parent, or like a spiritual authority. We may as well put it in Pisces. So this is an internalized value system of how to be good enough, right? To get rewards, to meet expectations of others or of the world, to not look like a fool, to not make a mistake or catastrophically fuck up. And as Saturn burns into the heat of the sun, we may have these moments of becoming excruciatingly, like dramatically aware, right? Because they're having like an alchemical, when the sun and Saturn come together, Saturn can relate to what is in darkness, right? In the shadow. Not like Pluto shadow in some sense, but shame is a Saturn thing. So it might be, this kind of basement, things are a little bit dank, and the sun is like shining light. So we do know that shame, like something that heals shame, is consciousness or light being shown on it. But it doesn't mean it doesn't feel excruciating or cringy to have the light shine on a place where there hasn't been light in a while, right? Or it can be quite illuminating, like revelatory, to have the light shown on a place that's not used to getting light. But we might have these moments of becoming excruciatingly aware of our shortcomings, our failures, or in a very Piscean way, like our falls from grace. So Pisces has this kind of ideal vision or higher self vision, right? It can see other people's potential, or it can see the potential of how life could be, and also see how life or other people fall short. So it's kind of like if you have ever witness someone in their suffering, in their illusion, right? And you feel like you have answers to their problems. Like if you just did this differently, or if you just recognized this resource that you have within yourself and you just took these steps, you could be in a higher place. And kind of that comparison of where a person is or where reality is in comparison to where it could be. So this is where Pisces, can really be a visionary, or it's ruled by Jupiter traditionally, so it's also has like a teacher quality to it, right? That ability to see what's possible and to hold someone inside of that vision. But it can also be how we cast judgment, because we see that fall from grace, right? Or if you are looking backwards at mistakes that you made, and with hindsight you can see like, oh, I should have just taken this other turn, things would have been better, it would have worked out better, but you didn't have that vision then. So that kind of tendency maybe to judge things according to this highest possible standard. And that's why I say fall from grace. If this is projected outwardly onto others, this could show up in places where we can't forgive others, or we can't find peace in relationship to whatever transpired. If this is projected outwardly onto the world, which is, I think, abundant right now, there's a sense of doom or despair about the trajectory of affairs, right? And that can be it can be very deadening or disempowering in some sense, or it can kind of filter everything in this kind of emergency response. Some people do find their role in putting out fires or being an emergency responder. Some people's dharma, or what they're doing, there's like a longer game that's happening, or there's a channeling of something else that's happening, and it can be finding our way through this web of, this is what I'm seeing around me, but like, this is this dream that I'm here to cultivate and live out. And how do we do that in relationship to what we're perceiving, what we're agreeing upon collectively is reality, and the confusion therein. But where we're projecting outwardly this sense of a fall from grace, or things are not okay, misgivings are not reconciled philosophically or emotionally. In Pisces, the objective may be to universalize or come back to love and compassion. Maybe after we've touched the absence of it, or the symbolic opposite of it, right? Shining light, the sun, on this place that hasn't seen light for a very, very long time. This is when we recognize that pessimism or despair has gone too far in the direction of tinting our sight toward the negative about others or about the possibility in the moment. It could be our own internal process where it's like, I've done the shadow work or I've done the grief and I've like turned and churned this over and over again. And now I need to choose something regenerative or generative or creative. In these alchemical moments of putrefaction and disgust, while we temporarily, or hold on, I have to go back here. So inwardly, there is this possibility of turning ourselves inside out, right? If you are shining the light on a place within that normally doesn't see that, right? So like a shame experience for the Sun-Saturn, there can be these alchemical moments of putrefaction and disgust while we temporarily might find ourselves to be the worst human, right? Or so tragically messed up, flawed, or spiritually errant. I took that wrong turn. I messed up. I can't go back. I can't fix it. I can't change what happened. I messed up the timeline. I took a wrong turn. Like, how sad. Like how far this timeline has fallen from what could have been, right? And the kind of self-reprimanding that comes with that. Maybe wanting to crawl into a hole and simply cease to exist, right? And if you get into those spots, which I don't necessarily like wish on anyone, but they happen. They happen, I think, often too in like altered states or like psychedelic states, because altered states and psychedelic states or non-ordinary states of consciousness heighten what's happening internally. But I do think there's this kind of like alchemical moment. Stanislav Grof, I think, said that this high intensity of an experience is the funeral pyre of that experience. So in non-ordinary states, whether you're just having a moment, right? It doesn't have to be drug induced or something like that. But when we're in like a shame spiral, for example, it is a drunken state of consciousness. It is a distorted state. It is a non-ordinary state. It's a filter, right? And so it can get to these extremes. And that's what I'm talking about, where it's like the white flag appears, like the surrender, the like mercy, uncle, like I'm done moment. At the shame complex that has had us in a death grip, right? It's been squeezing the life out of something. And the awareness that whether that judgment came from culture, a parent, whatever, it's been living in us, right? At whatever proportion of, cause and effect or where things originate, who knows? It's like that thing is in us. We have maybe perpetuated it and held others to it as well. And even if the ideals are noble, the translation of those ideals into practice has been miserable and suffocating, right? So just these moments of like, I've been so hard on other people, I'm hard on myself, like maybe I just need to have a change of heart here. Judgment making and discernment has its uses and also its excesses. And Pisces will take things to cosmic grand proportions, whether or not we meant to consciously. So very curious to hear what your experience has been. And if you're relating to what I'm saying, you're like, I don't know what she's talking about. But essentially these moments of intensified transformation of some kind of shame or judgment. And then this kind of Piscean process within it of coming to love, forgiveness, compassion in a spot that's just gritty. So once we have this kind of death of our inner or outwardly directed perception and really just take a break from fermenting in the hell zone, sorry to be so dramatic with the language, we have an opportunity to revisit the original ideal or value in a much more human and down-to-earth form or expression, right? What was the value or ideal that got betrayed in this fall from grace? And in the punishing or the judgmental consciousness that is supposed to be protecting that ideal, we've fallen far from what that ideal actually is. So kind of like a humbling Virgoan experience of humility and coming back to a revisiting of like, what is this dream? What is this thing that I valued? And aligning ourselves more with that. So this kind of humbling experience where imperfection doesn't equal permanent consequence or hell, if you will, or removal from the garden, if you will. Saturn does want to look at the negative, where the holes in the ship are that need to be plugged up so we don't sink, right? It's the bodyguard, it's the bouncer, uh, it's the soldier, or kind of like the whoever is posted to try to defend or keep order in a space. But the sun wants to generate and create life. In Pisces, it wants to create a dream. The philosophical impasse is to find some way to accept what there is to grieve and to find a wholly different orientation to create and serve life that actually allows the greater dream and transmission space to exist in its own right. And positively, Sun-Saturn is a more deliberate, intentional attempt to support and facilitate, these are Saturnian words, creative emergence and joy, which are solar words. After we've thoroughly reckoned with hell as a place on earth and the negative experience of Sun-Saturn, especially in, the deep oceanic, religious, if you will, Pisces, we realize that indulging our inner critic and its furious attempts to keep us in line, which is keeping us postured and bracing and closure, it's depriving us of life, that indeed that part of us that's doing that is just scared of consequences like loss of connection, loss of belonging, humiliation, any other negative feeling that we're defended against. And that underneath its rigorous adherence to standards, there is a profound vulnerability to simply being alive, sensitive, and woundable. So if we are already aware that, without these things like shelter or covering in life, etc., that death, decay are these great equalizers, casual statement here, that we can be respectful of this aspect of reality of death without indulging it out of place, meaning an impulse for life, joy, creation, connection comes up, and we can facilitate and support it with grace, with kindness, with compassion, with playfulness, instead of recognizing it as a threat because that last time that I tried to live, something bad happened, and now I have to defend myself from this impulse towards life. These things of, towards kindness, compassion, playfulness, instead of cutting it off short because of shame or the need to be perfect or the need to not experience any consequences. And I don't mean fake niceness or trying to stay above it all either. I mean the real thing in the places that it's been the most difficult to cultivate it. And that's what makes it so powerful, so grounded, so authoritative, such a backbone, Sun-Saturn. Right? This kindness that is not fake, but real. It can be the appropriate use of boundaries and time, space, and energy to direct attention to something fruitful, creative, generative, proper protection of the magic, Pisces, and of our regenerative internal forces that can create new experiences as opposed to the part of us that's just in alert response and reaction. This is what even elevates our ability to be in relationship with the world around us in a more creative, generative, and playful way. It's the realignment of punishing consciousness to actual protection and service of a greater experience. So for some, this could look like protected time and space to surrender, right? It is Pisces season, and we're growing toward a full moon in Virgo, so there is something coming up that's making us feel like we need to be on top of it, like we need to fix it. Pisces is the part of us that lets go and surrenders and lets God, whereas Virgo is where we are personally responsible for sweeping the floors and doing our chores and doing the work and like tending to things. And there's this balance on this axis between effort and ease. And so that there may be a need, even though stuff is getting kicked up, to have some time to just indulge in restful activities that are like a butterfly being in the cocoon, or like that deep regenerative part of sleep where your cells and organs heal. To take momentary breaks from daytime lucid solar consciousness that is trying to be aware, awake, and solving problems with the mind. I was having a moment where was going through something, talked to an ex. It's Venus retrograde. You can be the one that reaches out to your ex, your exes. An ex and a mentor both told me, like, you know, maybe you should just crawl into a blanket and do self-care really hard. Like, watch a series, like, read a fantasy novel kind of thing. And so I found actually that I was in this hyperactive state of trying to be productive, trying to solve things, trying to like just really go for something in like a Virgoan way. And it was so profound to have the permission to receive that inspiration from others, to give myself that permission to just really go into that kind of cocoon regenerative state. And it worked wonders. I was very excited about it. I learned this Pisces season even that like listening to audio books that are like young adult fantasy novels while I clean was like, I can't believe I haven't discovered this earlier. Like that kind of blend between fantasy and escapism with Pisces, with practicality, Virgo. Right. And so kind of reorganizing where in our lives, like sometimes we do have to tend to things. They are emergent. They require a response. And there's other times where we cannot keep picking at a scab. We cannot keep trying to fix something. And we just have to wrap ourselves up and go to sleep for a moment. You know, even when I was, growing up at home with my family, when my parents would watch TV at the end of the day, I had this kind of like, well, you shouldn't, like, don't do that. Like, we should be alive. We should be pursuing like goals. Like, don't, like, we shouldn't zone out at the end of the day. That's wrong. And it's like, I was a kid. I was being held in the reality structure to the extent that I wasn't taking on the mental load of chores or bills or stuff like that. And now, with time and perspective, I understand the value of momentary breaks of consciousness where you allow yourself the reprieve from trying to figure things out or being a responsible agent in the world. Like when you just can like actually surrender, lay back, relax, be inside of leisure, whether that takes on a more passive kind or the active, play or dance or something that feels not just like zoning out, but whatever it is, whatever we actually kind of need to rebalance our systems, it's like there's something between Sun-Saturn of really supporting and facilitating those active solar awake lucid states, or turning that down of like, hey, buddy, it's time to just go to sleep and chill for a moment. The Sun, Saturn, and Pisces may have confronted us with our ideals that drive our metrics of success or what we think makes life worth it, while simultaneously showing us where we can be less fixated, rigid, or conditioned, or conditional. Pisces is a porous, relatively boundaryless sign that knows both extremes of ecstasy and despair. And it's a kind of wisdom with Sun, Saturn, and Pisces to realize that life knows no limits in either direction. Right? That you can have no limit in some sense. Maybe we do have upper limits, and that's something that we work on. But you can go on the ecstasy track and you can go on the despair track, and there's no end to either of them per se until we max out of it. Grief, horror, and shame are just as infinite as joy and creativity and ecstasy. We can't control that life will affect us or at times scathe us, right? That conditions will make it easier to go toward any or either of those tracks. But if anything and everything is possible, how do we create experiences that allow us to resource and cultivate these higher states of consciousness? How do we grieve? How do we seize indulging pain without bypassing what's important to look at or be with? How do we develop the hardiness to create joy or love even when life is not giving us the most apparent resources to do so? What resources for our spiritual life and well-being can we become aware of that are actually here? And if anything is possible, how can we anchor in what we are spiritually here for instead of getting distracted by what haunts us at the deeper corners of our minds? It's definitely not a faint-hearted placement, the Sun, Saturn, and Pisces, but it's simultaneously the part of us that gives us permission to have heart unconditionally, but still construct a life or set of values that protects our heart without defending us too greatly from life itself. So it's this dramatic pairing of planets that I hope makes more sense now, the Sun, Saturn, and Pisces, that's illuminating the moon in Virgo on the South Node in Virgo. So this is a release, right? The South Node is where things are diminishing, releasing, but where also things are getting kicked up and relived. So it's a release, even if also a temporary reliving of that which we deem imperfect or in need of fixing, where we are aware that something could be mended or repaired, and that we have the ability, agency, where we are aware that something could be mended or repaired and that it's our job to do it, supposedly, or really. But that's whether or not we have had the ability, agency, or efficacy in actually doing so. Some misalignments persist, right? If we could fix it, we did. If it was easy to fix, it was fixed. If it's persisting, if it's nagging, then there's a question here. Is it only our judgment of these things that has been distorted? Or can we simply not control the timing of when things release or get better or turn up for the better? So, for example, I've been thinking a lot about this kind of crisis that people have post social interactions, whether it's in person or on Zoom, or any format interacting with people, where after the fact, after everything's been said, especially in an environment where there was more maybe authenticity, less masking, maybe more vulnerability, wherever we judge that metrics of like the overshare, of like maybe I gave too much of myself or I let something out that I normally keep in. After the fact, there's like a private rumination that surfaces where people, I notice it more in women in particular. I don't know if it's so gendered, but this kind of after the fact rumination of like, why did I say that? Like, that was weird of me. Just like this kind of shame about how we showed up or how we simply existed or participated. And for many, this kind of haunted editing room punishment or critique session is not even noticed at a distance. It's like it is though, when people report it and they're like, oh, I noticed this thing that happened. But sometimes it's so merged with the personality that it's just almost like an objective fact of like, oh, I really messed that up. I shouldn't have said that. And there's like a shame that's coming up afterwards. And so this is also something I've really worked with in myself, truly, because I'm in, a multi-year process of like liberating myself and my essence and allowing myself to be embodied and to show up and whatnot. And what I've noticed over the years is that authentic part of me or a very involuntary, playful, silly, improvisational part of me, when it comes out, right, this other part of me comes online to be like, get back down. Like, you can't show yourself like you're supposed to be a certain way. So there's kind of like this internal battle and starting to realize where, like, what are those standards that I'm even holding myself to? What is it protecting me from? And I think that, this is a very Saturnian thing. It's our inner government. And the Sun-Saturn is like the inner government around how you're allowed to be, like how you're allowed to express, and what types of expression are wrong or off limits enough that either you don't do them to begin with, or when you let yourself out of the bag and you like let that part of yourself show that there's a punishment later. There's a sense of like, well, I got to reel that back in. There's a shame spiral that comes up. And the reality that can be transformed, right? It's like, it's noticing where it's a death grip, where that judgmental consciousness is just, scared. It's like an internalized superego. It's a trauma response, etc. And it doesn't have to just be bypassed or killed, but there's a process of creating safety for that part of ourselves, as well as safety for the part of ourselves that just wants to express and be. It's like deep, deep inner child soul healing kind of stuff to just like let yourself be who you are without shame in the moment or after the fact. On the other hand, this like detached, dispassionate ability to look at what we've said or done, right? The mistakes, where we were off or whatnot, breathing through the cringe, like without shame, and refine, right? Just through that awareness. Because if you start looking at what you're ashamed to look at, your choices can change, right? If you can look without shame at what you were previously ashamed of, transformation will happen. So that's a skill of mastery. Like that's this ability to be honest with ourselves, to reflect on what we'd like to do better or change, and not punish ourselves. Like that breaks cycles. All of that is great. And I'm talking about that to an extent, but I'm also talking about the unfair rules, the kind of problem that a part of us has with messiness, with life, with whatever natural parts of us exist that we can't fit into an imaginary expectation of what we should be or what life should be. It just pops out of that perfect grid and it doesn't fit or reconcile with what we think should be. Some imaginary expectation that we would be clever, not mess up words, smooth, attractive, morally upright, or perfect 100% of the time, right? And perfectionism might be a strong pattern in you. It might not be. Like some people who are more ruffle feathers, who are kind of audacious, who are kind of messy, have less perfectionism than people that are like trying to do things right and not fuck up. Right. So there is kind of a calibration of how much internal permission there is for the mess. Right. So if we look at this from like a Saturnian perspective, also, like I do a lot of research and work with Eros, the asteroid, the myth, the force in life, the erotic. And it does have a connection to Saturn, where essentially, like, there is a natural part of us in our youth where we just kind of radically take up space with whatever tantrum, anger, joy, whatever that we're having. And the culture or the family around us validates, makes okay, approves of some of that, and inevitably also doesn't approve of some of it. Of like, you need to stop crying. You need to stop having a tantrum. You can't have this tantrum in public. It's also the conditioning for youth of their sexuality of like, don't have it, like put it away, don't act on it. Right. So this kind of like the erotic, the impulses that we have and the way that the environment responds and the kind of internalized closure that creates and how essentially there is this kind of negotiation of like, you can have life force, you can have eros, you can be in touch with yourself, and you also are part of civilization or a community, and there are consequences for actions, right? So it's like that's kind of the complexity of what you're working with when you put Saturn and Eros together. And a lot of this exists in the unconscious. But if you are, and on the other hand, too, like if you just decide not to have shame and decide to like liberate everything inside of yourself all at once, that is going to feel incredibly wobbly, perhaps deeply out of range, and perhaps have a set of consequences that you can't hold, right? If you just, you know, leave your family, leave your job, decide to be a different person and be authentic, like suddenly, it's like too much, It's like the Saturn, that kind of boundary of like, well, how should you behave? How should you belong? Like has to have a seat at the table. The question is the negotiation, right? And like how much life energy is allowed versus where it's being squeezed into too small of a container. That's what we're looking at. And the line here of what's acceptable versus what's off limits is highly personal for an individual, right? And with Saturn and Pisces, that line is like a little bit, where is the line? Like there is a confusion of what the boundary is. So while some of our standards or judgments might exist in our world without issue, right? It's just very clear and integrated of like, yeah, I'm a no to that, or like that's not in my value system, and it's really not an issue. Some of the standards and judgments that we have exist more as a psychological split. And it makes intimacy or connection with life kind of sputter and short circuit in the very places where that part of ourselves or where that part of reality looms or threatens to make a cameo, and we just don't know how to be with it. We have made an issue with something that is at its heart perhaps a non-issue. Like it just is. It is a part of life. It is a part of the whole of things. And it's a punishing superego or idealistic perspective that cannot accept or include it, whether the unforgivable state of affairs will always be, or it's just a stop along the way of a developing trajectory. So an example that I included in the write-up that I'm going off of and kind of branching off from was like, an artist, someone who is at a soul, heart level, an artist, and they're born into a family where there's a parent that, is concerned about that. Like, art isn't going to pay the bills. So there's a Saturnian kind of fear and insecurity. The parent just wants their child to be okay in the world. But it's also very painful to receive the messaging that this thing that you're called towards is like not okay or not going to be efficacious in the world. And so when that person grows up and has internalized that parental figure, their artistic impulse, has to go through this conversation with the part of them that has repressed it, the part of them that still needs to rebel from that repression, the part of them that needs to reconcile with, that's not my voice. I just took it on, to belong in my family. Like these are complex internal negotiations that can happen where essentially the artistic impulse for this person goes from being wrong or scary or not okay to being something where both of these parts of the psyche have a seat at the table, can address, be acknowledged, thanked for what they're doing, and perhaps even reassigning that Saturnian protector element to support the artistic endeavor as opposed to trying to shut it down before it even begins. Within this lunar month, it's possible that some situations have arisen internally or in the environment around you, circumstantially, to confront us with some of these dimensions of ourselves and our worldviews. Where are we currently feeling out of alignment or inconvenienced? What's not working as well as it should be? Where was there a breakdown, or where did something fall apart and it's just not okay that it fell apart? Whether it's inside of you, if it's a bodily experience, if it's a relational breakdown, or if it's out there in the world or somewhere else outside of you and you're having to witness it or experience your relationship and participation to it. Alternately, How did something magical pierce through the messiness? What visions came or come of surrender and sleep and rest? How did a mistake, a wrong turn, or an inconvenience open a doorway to something we couldn't have known or met within ourselves or within our lives if we had successfully controlled everything according to our own vision? That may be available to us as we discover surrender this Pisces season, right? That's kind of the Sun and Saturn's one of their objectives here. Surrender and responsible dreaming, if you will. Maybe some of our illusions get eclipsed this eclipse season, and it allows us to relax into a vaster field beyond the grip of our most narrow expectations. Maybe it can even be a moment of praise, a hallelujah, to feel those possibilities or that levity in a place that was once so thoroughly defended against that much teeming life and all of its messy chaos. Right? The kind of joy of the permission to embrace what we were not allowed to embrace. Something that is natural to us, something that is natural to life, and we have reconciled or repaired our relationship to it. Sometimes that happens really easily, right? It's just kind of like you wake up one moment, almost like from a cloud of a dream, and you just have the vision and something's changed. And other times you really go through this kind of like bone crunching, like mortar and pestle, kind of like cringy alchemical putrefaction moment of Sun-Saturn. And I think that's part of what's happening during this lunar month. And yeah, it's a process. And hopefully kind of this overarching teaching around it supports you in the moment that you're going through that process, or maybe it's a seed for the future for that time where you have a Sun-Saturn-y kind of moment. I know I go through them and I always come out, but part of the Saturn experience is feeling like something's going to last forever, that the bad feeling is going to last forever, that the hole that you're in or the tunnel that you're in and you can't see the light at the end, that you're just going to be stuck there forever, right? Like that's kind of what we feel inside of Saturnian experiences. And it's so intense to feel like our possibilities are this kind of wide open Piscean world or relationship with God and with wonder is collapsed and contained in a moment. And that breakthrough of realizing it doesn't have to be that way, but we got to love ourselves, relate to ourselves at that kind of spiritual, emotional rock bottom moment. And possibly that gives us compassion to walk someone else through that portal when we find ourselves on that side of things. So a few things I want to share also. If you haven't already liked, commented, please do that. I am teaching another evolutionary astrology intensive. We're beginning May 6th. This is an amazing, extraordinary opportunity to learn astrological literacy in a way where you gain the concepts, the building blocks, but you learn how to really feel them and interpret them through your own voice and life experience so that the archetypes are your friends, they're your homies, you know them, you can actually feel them, so that while astrology is somewhat academic, right, because we're learning concepts and techniques and how to put things together, that you can relate to the practice from a more felt, connected, like personal epiphany kind of way. My students are repetitively blown away by how their world opens up, how they can see archetypes, how they can, guess an actor when they're watching a show, like what they have going on astrologically and look it up and their intuition was right. When they start to feel the planets and like the universe talking to them, because as Dane Rudhyar says, astrology is a language, and when you speak this language, the sky speaks to you. And it is true. It is a enchanted, magical practice. It gives us so much insight about ourselves and other people. But it's amazing to just see the world and universe expand when we're playing with the world of archetype, when we turn on our archetypal eye, and when we can hear what life is saying to us through that language. So this is a 5-month class. We do meet pretty much weekly live. There is pre-recorded content, and then we come live to talk about it and also do some kind of workshop-y things live, including reading whole charts at the end of class. But it's a really great opportunity to learn astrology in community with direct, mentorship. I do really get to know my students and support the group in like really working through these concepts and understanding them for yourself in an intimate way. I think it's a truly extraordinary astrology experience. I'm really proud and stoked to be offering it. And I would advise you, highly recommend to check out the course page linked in the notes, learn more about it, apply. It is by application. So I do get on calls with people before just to make sure the class is a fit for you. And you can also, read more about the class and read student testimonials. Another thing is that I am offering consults right now that are a special. They are Eros and the fixed signs focus. So I do look at the asteroid Eros and this general question in the chart about aliveness. You may have noticed on my channel, on my podcast, that I can talk about the fixed signs for days and days and days, because I do think that the fixed signs relate to creative mastery. They relate to creative breakthrough, soul retrieval, how we relate to our life force, how we invest our life force into things that create more energy and give back to us versus how we siphon or kind of get our life force stuck in these, negative loops or channels or addictions, if you will. So working with the concepts of the fixed signs have helped me really like pull my energy out of channels that weren't good for it and learn how to create energy, create aliveness, learn how to bring my nervous system online in new ways, how to like retrieve parts of me from freeze. It's deep stuff, the fixed signs. So looking at those parts of your chart for your own astrological mapping, like for your own insight and revelation about how the erotic, how aliveness is telling a story in your chart. I've loved doing these readings so far. I'm going to leave the link in the notes if you would like to book one. I'm going to be adding some more spots for that. So there are some juicy magical ways to work with me coming up ahead. If you are wanting to learn astrology, you're wanting to, have the experience with astrology, it is an all levels course. So if you've been taking in astrology content and you don't know how to read charts for yourself or think astrologically for yourself, my course is for that, like how to cultivate your own astrological sight. How to have that kind of click where you get astrology. Especially it's in this evolutionary astrology lineage, which is about the soul's ongoing evolution from life to life. So how this lifetime is a perfect alchemical training container for what it is that your soul came here to do, to experience, to learn. As well as, validating like what has been rough, like what have been the challenges in your life, and understanding these things from a greater philosophical frame that allows you to see the hardships that you've had in your life in a much more creative and compassionate lens that can be so transformative. If you can't already tell, I'm like in love with evolutionary astrology, in love with sharing it with people. So I'm going to leave it there and just I was saying it's all levels. So even if you are trained in another type of astrology, like Hellenistic, or you just feel like going deeper into material inside of an alchemical space, inside of a community with mentorship directly, then this class is for you. But go ahead, learn more about it, apply, and we can have a conversation about it to see if this is your time to go deeper into astrology. I love you all. Thank you so much for watching, for being here, and I'll see you again soon.